Hello, everybody. It's great to be speaking at Hive. I'm Jessica, and this is Alex, and we're from the McPinn Foundation, which is a mental health research charity. Today's talk is based on a qualitative research study that Alex and I conducted last year. So we used peer research methods to explore participants' experiences of a new virtual reality therapy called Game Change. And today we're going to talk about how we use peerness, or experiential understanding, in its different forms and other techniques to develop shared and built understandings of what was going on for our participants. It is based on an analysis of the interview data, specifically looking for disclosures and uses of peerness, and trying to identify the impact this had on the interview. We also had our field notes to draw on.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the intervention. Game Change is an automated virtual reality therapy which helps people with severe social avoidance and psychosis. It helps them to feel less anxious in everyday social situations through being immersed in VR scenarios and practicing using a VR headset. Results from the trial have just been published and show that the therapy works. Jess and I carried out the qualitative study, which explored people's experiences of Game Change and their life before and after taking part. Okay.
Sorry. There we go. That's the flyer.
This image is from the flyer that the participants of the qual study were given when they were first introduced to the idea, and it discloses about my lived experience of mental health. We use the peer research approach, which means that I have similar lived experiences as the interview participants. I shared this during the interview process to the degree that I felt comfortable with. I was responsible for recruitment, so when we had a pre-call before the interview, I disclosed my lived experience. And at the beginning of the interview, I disclosed this again.
And this is what participants knew about me before they met me in the interview. So I'm a qualitative researcher with experience of anxiety, which I sometimes disclosed at the start of the interviews. And the study, we should also say that the study had the benefit of a lived experience advisory group whose members, like Alex, had similar mental health experiences to the participants.
So I'll tell you a bit more about the study methodology. As part of the recruitment process, I phoned each participant as a pre-call and discussed my lived experience. In total, 20 in-depth interviews were completed. We could not interview in person due to COVID restrictions. Instead, the interviews were carried out by Zoom or telephone, according to participant preference. So out of the 20 interviews, Jess and I did just under half of them together. Then as time ticked away and we needed to crack on with the analysis, I did 10 interviews by myself and Jess did 1 interview alone. At the end of the interview, we asked all participants about whether having me as a peer researcher influenced their decision to take part in the interview and whether they thought I had impacted their experience of the interview. 10 said that the presence of a peer researcher, me, encouraged them to take part, and 14 said the presence of the peer researcher, also me, had an impact on their experience of the interview. It was interesting that 14 participants wanted a follow-up call after the interview with me, the peer researcher. This suggests that they found my presence and involvement useful, or maybe they just wanted someone to talk to.
Okay. So this is an overview of our findings. We suggest that using peerness creates a shared understanding between the participant and the peer interviewer. And from looking at our data, we were able to categorize the types of peerness used, identify different ways it was used, and speculate on its impact based on the data set and participants' answers to the questions at the end of the interview, the ones Alex just mentioned. From reflecting on our experiences and the field notes we kept, we identify some risks to using peerness. And today we also want to draw attention to the extra cognitive and emotional work that is going on behind the scenes for the peer researcher. So Types of peerness. Well, we identified two main types that we used in the interview. And the first of these is mental health peerness. So yeah, this is related to shared mental health experiences, which we'll be discussing more of in a minute. But we noticed, yeah, this varied along a couple of dimensions. So we've got a kind of implicit dimension. So as Alex mentioned earlier, she explicitly said a couple of times in the run up to the interview that she was a peer researcher. And then sometimes during the interviews, she could very much sort of make it clear that, by drawing on her own lived experience, like specific examples. But otherwise, there was also sort of a lot of like implicit uses of peerness, I think, that would be more kind of just more subtle cues, head nods in the right places, or vocalizations, or, just to really give a sense that, building on those previous disclosures, that Alex understood what was going on for the participants. And then the granularity of the kinds of disclosures that Alex made. So sometimes it could be quite specific recall of memories, anecdotes, and then sometimes it was much more kind of general comments. So then the other type of peerness, which we both used, especially at the start, was non-mental health peerness. I guess these are kind of other common experiences that we had, and as I'm sure many of you do, we use them to kind of build rapport. So examples for us could be having asthma, family relationships, the stress of A levels, the importance of exercise, playing an instrument during the lockdown. Those were all kind of nice ways that we could connect with the participants that weren't related to our mental health.
So how did I use peerness? Well, there were different ways. Firstly, I talked about the disclosure on the recruitment flyer during the pre-call and at the start of the interview. During the interview itself, I used validation. I was reassuring and encouraging, for example, saying something like, "That's really interesting. It's almost like the VR was a practice world," or something. I used nodding, agreeing, saying that is what happened to me, or I briefly explained a similar experience. I used clarifying questions, and I told the participants when I appreciated their honesty. I also used paraphrasing. For example, I said, "It sounds to me like you push yourself to go to social situations regarding of your anxiety." I could be sensitive to potential triggers for a participant, giving them permission not to answer a question if they didn't feel comfortable. The fact that I was a peer enabled me to be sensitive to how the participant was feeling. I shared experiences very specific to psychosis, including symptoms, medication, and hospitalization. I gave examples of the lived experience I shared. So another way in which I used peerness was through humor and anecdotes, and I was able to draw on lived experience in more subtle ways when I felt when I felt comfortable. So for example, this man was talking about his quality of life being pretty zero, and I decided to use subtle humor and an anecdote of when I was unwell, and the only reason I left the house was to go to buy chicken and chips from the chicken and chip shop, and that was just to fuel me, to keep me going. It was interesting reading the interview transcript because the gentleman brought this anecdote up later in the interview and thanked me for sharing it with him. Through sharing a small part of my story, I was able to build up a shared understanding with the participant.
Great. I think this is a really good example of you using like a very kind of specific, granular memory, explicit sort of mental health peerness. And I think it worked really well with this particular participant. But also, as you just said, Alex, I think you drew on your peerness in more subtle ways. So you just mentioned that you were able to kind of tune into the participant and kind of pick up on when they were feeling tired or maybe a bit drained by the questions, or maybe just sometimes like pick up when they might find a question too abstract. And it was almost like you would sometimes give them permission not to answer a question. And I don't think that anyone ever didn't answer a question, but it was nice that it felt like you were kind of creating a safe space for the participants. And I think another way that you drew on it was that because you had an idea of what was going on for them, you could anticipate the prompts more easily that would be needed to open up the conversation and to get people to expand, because you really had a sense of what they might want to talk about next. And yeah, I think just as an observer, I think there were some moments where, yeah, you and the participant were kind of going back and forth a little bit, and it's almost like you were scoping out each other's experiences and scoping out the overlap between them. And just, yeah, as a kind of outsider, those were the moments that I felt that the sort of the balance of power in the interview had really kind of equilibrated, I guess. Because yeah, it felt like they really saw you as a peer. Great. Okay. So yeah, I guess we're arguing that Alex's use of peerness enabled a shared understanding to be built between her and the participant. And there are kind of subtle clues in the data that this kind of intersubjectivity had been built. So for example, in this quote, you've got the participant identifying with what Alex said. You know, it's like what you were saying about. And then using this as a jumping off point to describe her experiences. And then she checks back in with Alex to see whether this resonates. And Alex expands on this shared idea and the participant agrees. So other examples of this kind of shared understanding would just be people using the collective we, so to encompass Alex and themselves, and what their shared understanding of life is like. So here was something like, it just made me feel like I'm not alone. I know we have good and bad days, don't we? In another interview, when they're discussing the kind of terminology around diagnosis, this we, so Alex and the participant, was sort of, I guess, pitted against, or, you know, was in contrast to they, which were the psychiatrists who had their sort of preferred diagnostic terms. You know, and also participants sometimes would check in and say things like, you know, I don't know if it was like this for you, but it was for me. So it was clear that they were seeing Alex as a peer. So what impact did this have on the interview? Well, participants revealed personal information and told us about difficult experiences during the interviews, sometimes without needing not too much prompting. But sometimes from looking at the data, it seems like the emotional intensity of what they told us sometimes seemed to increase after its disclosure by Alex. So in a couple of occasions, this was an admission of previous suicidal feelings, or it could be a comment on the impact on their sense of self of their symptoms. So remember how Alex would only leave the flat to get chicken and chips in that interview? Well, after she had given that disclosure, the participant replied, it just makes you feel like you're almost not a human being, doesn't it? It makes you feel like you're a bit of a zombie in some ways. And for me, this is just a really powerful quote because it basically gets to the heart of how his symptoms are making him feel less than human.
Yes, so I was definitely able to use sympathy in an explicit way in the interviews. For example, this is a quote of what I said. I can really sympathize with you because I've had experience of hearing voices and it's just unbelievable. It's so nasty what they're like and the way you can't escape from it and stuff. And the participant responded, yes, it is. I think that this revealing disclosure from me helped build trust between me and the participants. It potentially opened up the interview as the trust grew and the participant later revealed more about themselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like that distinction between sympathy and empathy, I think is important. You know, like I can try as hard as I might to empathize with the participants and put myself in their shoes. But because psychosis in particular is such an unusual experience, like I really cannot sympathize. But Alex can. And I think some of the things, you know, the positive responses that she was giving, the kind of the validating, the reassuring, the encouraging, you know, coming from Alex, because Alex had a real idea of what those people had been through, what their lives had previously been like, you know, to give a positive, encouraging response, like it really means something. It comes across as really genuine. And I think maybe, you know, rather than like patronizing or trite, I think that was really important. And yeah, I agree that the trust was built. And, you know, sometimes we would have participants asking us questions. So sometimes asking us like whether their symptoms are normal, or just whether they'd done a good job at the end of the interview. So making themselves quite vulnerable. And I think that shows trust in us. And this is just another quote of Alex kind of getting the next prompt that she needed to ask, and then also kind of just sympathizing really with how difficult the situation was.
Okay, so we asked participants whether the presence of a peer researcher had made an impact on their experience. They said things like it made them feel more comfortable, and they felt reassured that they would be speaking to someone who would have an idea of what they had been through. The interviews were reassuring to those who were anxious about talking to new people. The participants said they felt understood and they felt less alone. I think there was a real sense that because psychosis is such an unusual experience, people who haven't experienced it really can't understand. In a way, I felt like a role model. I was asked direct questions like, did I take medication, and what was my path going back to work after being unwell? So here's some more reflections. Why did I put up this picture? Well, peer research is about sharing of experience, shared understanding and commonality. And I think that this picture of two twins who look similar and are sharing a ball represents this. I enjoyed supporting the participants to open up in the interview. I think that we built a reciprocal relationship and trust was built. I supported the participants with their mental health and helped them to normalize their experiences. I've also worked as a peer support worker, and I found that my listening, empathy and sympathy skills from this role came in handy during the interviews. On a personal level, I found the experience self-confidence building. It was a cathartic process and a stepping stone into employment. It normalized some of my psychotic experiences, and I felt empowered and part of an important cause. So as a researcher, I felt that using peerness was a bit of a grey area. There was emotional labour involved, and I wondered about boundaries and oversharing. I also wondered, should I be offering support and advice? For example, this participant that you can see the quotes on the screen had gone back to work full time and ended up quitting this job not long after. I suggested they go back to work or a course part-time based on my own experience. This advice seemed relevant, but I wondered who was I as the peer researcher to tell this participant what I thought he should do. I was put in a position of responsibility.
Oh, sorry.
So other risks of using peerness for the participants. I sometimes wondered, was I being a help or a hindrance? There was potential for embarrassment or confusing the participants. I worried about inadvertently triggering the participant with my questions and comments. There were also divisive topics. For example, in one interview, it was brought up, should patients be forced to take antipsychotics? I personally am pro-medication as I think it helps, but one of the ladies I spoke to felt she was forced to take medication. I had to be sensitive to her opinion and make sure not to offend or upset her by talking about my own opinion. There was some extra cognitive work going on behind the scenes. I had to plan during the interview and consider what is appropriate for me to share, how much should I share, how much do I feel comfortable sharing. There was also a blurring with other roles, for example, my other role as a peer support worker. So this extra cognitive work, early on in the interviews, I tested out different approaches to use of peerness. I kept an eye on which methods were effective at opening the participant up. I used reassurance, encouragement, appreciation of honesty, and paraphrasing. I was aware that I shouldn't talk too much, as in this type of interview, it is the participant who should be doing most of the talking.
Okay. And just a few reflections from me. So far we've spent some time proposing that the mental health peerness that Alex had in common with the participants meant that a shared understanding between them was created. And it's hard to say what impact this had on the data, but we certainly got a rich data set that was rich enough for our purposes, and people shared with us wide-ranging experiences of the intervention, so good and not so good, which is what we were hoping for. But yeah, what if you don't have direct mental health experiences in common with participants? can you still reach some kind of understanding? And I think I'm going to argue that you can, but it's a kind of built understanding. There was only one instance in the interview that I did alone, but looking at the transcript, yeah, I think you could say that we built this together. And it would not be to the sort of the same level of understanding that the peer researcher could have by any means, but I think for our purposes with this participant, it was sufficient for a rich interview. So yeah, I used some different tactics. So I used a lot of clarifying questions, and I did less like comparing sort of my transcript to some of Alex's. You know, Alex's was using much more kind of paraphrasing, like especially when she sort of felt that there was a common experience, she would often paraphrase. And I think I was kind of constantly clarifying the whole time. There was a sense that I was working with the participant to co-construct a narrative, and we were kind of sense making together. But he was great, and he was really open to kind of building this rapport and like going over his story like backwards and forth and oops, that is not what I meant to do. Sorry. Yeah, so we were going back and forth and working how it all fit together and where the contradictions were. And I was kind of advancing hypotheses as well rather than paraphrasing. And I think the other thing that helped was that this interview was further along the timeline. So I'd been in other interviews with Alex and just also had the benefit of listening to what the other interviews were saying. So I had all this other stuff for context that I could draw on. So yeah, I think this resulted in trust, vulnerability, and rich data. But it was definitely a long interview, and so it took a while to build up the picture of this person's experience.
So here are some final thoughts. The use of peerness gave the interviews colour, shape, and structure. There was a real equilibrium of power between myself and the participants. The way that Jess and I interviewed in pairs brought two perspectives, and this helped reduce the risks that we've talked about. We ended up with a rich data set with which we were able to do a robust qualitative analysis. We also mentioned earlier that we had the benefit of working with a lived experience advisory panel who have similar experiences to me. When considering using peer research, consider the extra cognitive and emotional work. Also, you need to consider the extra time and cost to the project.
And thank you to the funders and commissioners of the Game Change project, the NIHR and Oxford University. It was really great to work with our partners at Oxford, and we are currently about to submit a paper for peer-reviewed journal. Yeah, I think that we learned a lot from them, but I also think that they learned from us as well. So thank you for listening today. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, those are our email addresses. If you'd like to find out more about the McKim Foundation, just an unashamed plug to follow our socials, or to even better, sign up to our newsletter or involvement bulletin. And yes, I'm looking forward to discussions and reflections in the Q&A after the talk. Thanks a lot.